Welcome to the Haunting Horror channel. Please subscribe, like this video, give this video a like and write a comment. Thank you and enjoy watching. The pen felt heavy in my hand, the familiar blue ink staining my thumb a faint smudge. The lined paper shimmered under the harsh fluorescent light, each empty line a taunting reminder of the battle raging within. Another story, huh, Evelyn? Agnes rasped from the bed beside me, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Her rheumy eyes held a flicker of curiosity beneath the cloudy white cataracts. Just trying to keep the cobwebs at bay, I muttered, the scratch of the pen against the paper, a comforting counterpoint to the symphony of coughs and groans echoing through the sterile room. My fingers traced the worn leather cover of the well-worn journal, its pages filled with a lifetime of stories, vivid memories of sun-drenched California and the salty tang of the Pacific breeze from my youth mingled with the more recent, darker entries about life here at Hillcrest Manor. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor across the room jolted me back to the present. Mrs. Davis, once a vibrant woman with a passion for gardening, now lay skeletal and pale, barely clinging to life. A lump formed in my throat, the metallic tang of fear familiar on my tongue. "You look troubled, dear," Agnes croaked, her voice laced with a surprising empathy. "Is it another one of those nightmares?" I forced a smile, the effort etching new lines on my already weathered face. "Just thinking about the past, that's all." But the past wasn't just memories, not anymore. It was a relentless tide threatening to pull me under. The fear of forgetting, of succumbing to the same fate as Mrs. Davis, gnawed at me like a starving rodent. "The past is a tricky thing," Agnes wheezed, her voice surprisingly strong for a moment. "Sometimes it best stays buried." Her words struck a chord, resonating with a truth I desperately wanted to deny. The horrors I'd witnessed on that forsaken island in the Pacific, the echoes of gunfire and the hollow stares of the starving men were a constant presence, a shadow clinging to the edges of my mind. Closing my eyes, I fought back a wave of nausea. Writing it down, forcing the memories onto the page, had been my way of keeping them at bay. Each story, each letter to my long-deceased husband, was a desperate attempt to hold on to myself, to prove that I was still Evelyn, the sharp-tongued rancher's daughter, not just another nameless face lost in the labyrinth of Hillcrest Manor. Taking a shaky breath, I dipped the pen back into the inkwell, the familiar scent a grinding force. My fingers hovered over the paper, the blank lines a daunting challenge. But then, a single word formed in my mind, a seed waiting to be planted. "Mikiko," I whispered, the name of the island a guttural curse escaping my lips. Perhaps, I thought, by finally confronting the darkness, I could reclaim a piece of myself, a piece I thought lost forever. The incessant drip, drip, drip from the leaky faucet outside echoed through the silent hallway, a monotonous counterpoint to the symphony of snores and restless tossing emanating from behind closed doors. Sleep, a precious commodity these days, eluded me once again. Slipping out of bed, my arthritic joints protesting like rusty hinges, I shuffled toward the source of the irritating sound. Agnes, an unsettling silhouette in the dim hallway light, was already hunched over the sink, her frail figure dwarfed by the overflowing basin. "Can't sleep either, I see," she croaked, her voice a dry rasp in the stillness. "The faucet," I mumbled, pointing to the source of the dripping. "Just one more thing to keep us company, wouldn't you say?" She straightened, her face hidden in shadow. "You writing your stories again?" I clutched the worn leather journal closer to my chest, a defensive gesture that startled even myself. "Just some thoughts," I lied, the word catching awkwardly in my throat. The silence stretched, broken only by the insistent drip, drip, drip. They say the mind goes first. You know, Agnes rasped, her voice a chilling whisper. Memories fade, leaving only emptiness. A shiver ran down my spine. The fear I'd been trying to suppress all night threatened to engulf me. Was that what awaited me? A slow descent into oblivion, where even the terrors of the past would fade into nothingness. Not if you don't let it, I forced out, my voice barely above a whisper. There's still fight left in this old dog. Agnes chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that scraped against my nerves. Fight the inevitable, Evelyn. It's a battle you can't win. Her words hung heavy in the air, a dark prophecy. But I refused to surrender. There's more to life than waiting for death. Even here, I said, my voice surprisingly firm. We can still find meaning, purpose. We can tell our stories. A flicker of something akin to respect sparked in Agnes' cloudy eyes. Stories, she echoed, the word a sigh on her lips. Yes, I said, my voice gaining strength. Stories of our lives, both the joys and the sorrows. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we remember it. And suddenly, the leaky faucet didn't seem so annoying anymore. It represented a small victory, a reminder that the world still responded to our actions, however small. Perhaps you're right, Evelyn, Agnes said softly. Perhaps there's still a story left to tell. A fragile hope bloomed in my chest, pushing back the fear. With newfound determination, I returned to my room, the echo of Agnes' words propelling me forward. I wouldn't succumb to the darkness. I would write my story, my defiance etched forever in ink. The morning sunlight, weak and diluted, streamed through the dusty window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stale air. I clutched the warm journal in my hands, a shield against the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that clung to me like a shroud. Today, I wouldn't write about the rolling hills of my childhood ranch or the bustling streets of San Francisco in my younger days. Today, I would face the monster in the shadows, the memories of Mikiko. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I dipped the pen into the inkwell, the familiar scent a grinding force. Where do you even begin? I muttered to myself, the question echoing with a hollow finality. A soft rapping at the door startled me. Evelyn, are you awake? It was Mary, the ever-cheerful nurse's aide, her face perpetually etched with a smile that seemed pasted on a bit too tightly. Good morning, Mary, I croaked, trying to inject a note of cheer into my voice. I brought you your breakfast, dear, she chirped, pushing a tray laden with lukewarm oatmeal and a glass of cloudy orange juice through the doorway. And what's that you're writing there? Another story. I hesitated, the weight of the unwritten words heavy on my chest. Just jotting down some memories, I mumbled, carefully keeping the journal out of sight. Mary's smile faltered for a fleeting moment. Memories can be tricky things, can't they? She said, her voice strangely low. Sometimes it's best to leave them buried. Her words echoed Agnes' haunting whisper from the night before. Was everyone here conspiring to keep me from confronting the past? Or was there a truth they knew, a truth too terrible to face? But not all memories are bad, are they? I countered, forcing a smile. Some remind you of the good times, the people you loved. Mary's smile returned, but it seemed strained. Of course, she said quickly. Well, you enjoy your breakfast, dear. I'll check back on you later. As the door clicked shut, a strange unease settled over me. The fear I'd been trying to suppress all night clawed its way back, a cold weight in my stomach. Was I wrong to delve into the darkness of Mikiko? Or was it the only way to finally exorcise the demons that haunted me? With a newfound resolve, I opened the journal, the blank page confronting me like a blank canvas. My fingers hovered over the pen, hesitant at first, then finding their rhythm. The first words spilled onto the page, tentative at first, then flowing with a desperate urgency. Mikiko, I wrote to name a battle cry against the encroaching silence. A humid jungle island, shrouded in mist and the stench of death. The humid air clung to me like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. Sweat trickled down my temples, blurring the already hazy jungle scene before me. The monotonous drone of insects filled the air, a relentless counterpoint to the pounding of my heart in my chest. It had been weeks since our patrol ship had been sunk, leaving us stranded on this forsaken island with dwindling supplies and a gnawing fear twisting our guts. We were 5 Marines: Johnson, the grizzled veteran; Miller, the eternally optimistic rookie; Ramirez, the quiet sharpshooter; and Harris, the joker whose humor had thinned with each passing day; and me, Evelyn, the only woman in the group, a stark contrast to the camouflage that failed to hide the tremor in my hands. "We should keep moving," Johnson rasped, his voice rough with dehydration. "There has to be a freshwater source somewhere on this damn island." His words echoed the desperation that gnawed at us all. Hunger gnawed at our bellies, thirst parched our throats, and the ever-present threat of the enemy lurked in the dense foliage. We pushed forward, hacking through the tangled undergrowth, the silence broken only by the rasp of our breaths and the occasional snap of a twig. An unsettling stillness hung in the air, broken only by the cries of unseen birds. "You hear that?" Miller whispered, his voice tight with fear. We all stopped, straining our ears. A low guttural growl, unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard, echoed through the trees. A shiver ran down my spine, and I clutched my rifle tighter, the wood cold and slick with sweat in my palm. "What the hell was that?" Ramirez muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay together," Johnson ordered, his voice devoid of its usual gruffness. "We don't know what's out there." We pressed on, the growl echoing closer this time, a primal fear clawing at my throat. The jungle floor was littered with skeletal remains of long-dead animals, a grim testament to the harshness of this place. Suddenly, Johnson slammed on the brakes, holding up a hand for silence. Through a gap in the foliage, a sight met our eyes that would forever be etched in my memory. Figures emerged from the undergrowth, skeletal figures with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks, their uniforms hanging in tatters on their emaciated frames. They were Japanese soldiers, but unlike any soldier I'd ever seen. Gone was the discipline, the fighting spirit. These were men driven to the brink of madness, their hollow gazes devoid of humanity. "They're starving," Miller stammered, his voice barely a whisper. A wave of nausea washed over me. The guttural growl from before intensified, turning into a low moan that sent shivers down my spine. The starving soldiers shuffled forward, their movements erratic and jerky. "They won't hesitate to attack," Johnson said grimly, his hand tightening on his rifle. "We need to get out of here." But retreat was cut off as another group of these emaciated figures materialized behind us. We were surrounded, trapped in a macabre nightmare. The worn journal felt cool in her hands, its leather cover whispering of secrets kept. Tonight, the flickering candlelight danced across the faded ink, illuminating the 5th entry. A knot tightened in her stomach. This was the turning point, the night everything fractured. She reread the sentence, its starkness a punch to the gut. "We leave at dawn." Her eyes stung with unshed tears. Escape. It was a word they dared not breathe aloud for months, a desperate flicker of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. A creak on the floorboards sent a jolt through her. The door creaked open a sliver, revealing a face etched with worry. "You haven't slept," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She forced a smile, the lie sharp on her tongue. Just finishing some notes. He crossed the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The firelight cast long shadows on his face, deepening the lines carved by hardship. "We can't keep living like this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Every day feels like we're teetering on the edge." She nodded, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. Fear gnawed at her, a constant companion. But the alternative, another day under their oppressive rule, another day living a lie, was unthinkable. "Are you sure this is the right choice?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. She met his gaze, determination hardening in her eyes. "There's no guarantee of safety out there," she admitted. "But here, there's no life at all." He pulled her into a tight embrace, the warmth a fleeting comfort in the face of the unknown. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken anxieties. They both knew the risks. Capture meant a fate worse than death. Finally, he pulled back, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. "Then we fight," he said, his voice firm. "Together." A surge of fierce love washed over her. They were in this together, two souls bound by a shared yearning for freedom. They may not know what awaited them beyond the horizon, but they would face it, hand in hand. The night wore on, filled with whispered plans and stolen kisses. The weight of the decision pressed down on them, but a spark of hope flickered in the darkness. They would leave at dawn, chasing a dream of a life beyond the walls of their gilded cage. As she finally drifted off to sleep, clutching the journal close, she knew this wasn't just an escape. It was the start of a new beginning. The first rays of dawn blowed through the cracks in the boarded windows, casting an unwelcome grey light across the room. Sleep had been a fragile visitor, chased away by a whirlwind of nervous anticipation. She rose, the floorboards groaning under her bare feet, and moved towards the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Ready?" He stood by the door, a knapsack slung over his shoulder, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and grim determination. She nodded, her throat tight. There was no turning back now. They crept down the creaking stairs, each step echoing in the pre-dawn silence like a death knell. The air hung heavy with the weight of their secret, the old house groaning as if shading their anxieties. Reaching the kitchen, they paused, their eyes scanning the familiar space for the last time. A pang of nostalgia tugged at her heart. This place, once a symbol of security, now represented everything they were running from. "We should take some food," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. She rummaged through the pantry, her hands trembling. Hunger was a distant concern, but they couldn't risk venturing out empty-handed. Settling on a few hard bread rolls and a hunk of cheese, she stuffed them into her bag. A sudden crash from outside sent them scrambling for cover. Her breath caught in her throat. Had they been discovered? She pressed her ear against the wall, straining to hear any sound beyond the pounding of her own heart. Silence. A tense moment stretched into an eternity before he spoke, his voice barely audible. Maybe it was just the wind. She nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. The wind wouldn't have sounded like that. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. Their carefully laid plans could unravel so easily, dashed against the harsh reality of their situation. Steeling her nerves, she straightened. There was no time for second thoughts. "We need to go," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. They slipped out the back door, melting into the shadows. The pre-dawn mist clung to the ground, swirling around their ankles like phantoms. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from the distant forest. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She hesitated, a map flickering in her mind. Escape routes had been meticulously planned, memorized in hushed tones under the cloak of darkness. "The old quarry," she finally said, pointing towards a cluster of dark shapes against the lightning sky. "We can follow the river from there." They set off at a brisk pace, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves under their feet and the occasional snap of a twig. Every rustle of wind, every creak of a branch, sent shivers down her spine. Were they being followed? They reached the abandoned quarry just as the sun peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The silence here was oppressive, broken only by the distant cry of a crow. "We need to keep moving," he urged, his voice laced with urgency. She nodded, her gaze darting nervously around. This wasn't the safest place to linger, but it offered a temporary reprieve from the watchful eyes they were trying to escape. With a final glance back at the life they were leaving behind, they plunged deeper into the waiting woods, the unknown path ahead both terrifying and exhilarating. The dense forests swallowed them whole, a green labyrinth of towering trees and tangled undergrowth. Sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting the forest floor in an eerie twilight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a far cry from the sterile air of their old life. They moved with a practiced silence, years of living under constant surveillance honing their stealth. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through them, but they pressed on, driven by the desperate need to put distance between themselves and the oppressive regime they were fleeing. Hours blurred into one another. Hunger gnawed at their bellies and fatigue weighed heavily on their limbs. They rationed their meager water supply, each precious drop a lifeline in the parched wilderness. He stumbled, his foot catching on a gnarled root. She caught him by the arm, steadying him. "You all right?" she asked, concern etched on her face. He nodded, wincing slightly. "Just a scrape. Nothing to worry about." She wasn't convinced. The escape had taken a toll on him, both physically and emotionally. Doubt, a persistent shadow, flickered in his eyes. "We can stop for a bit," she offered, her voice soft. He hesitated. "We need to keep moving. Every second we stay here." "We'll be fine," she insisted, forcing a smile. She knew the fear gnawed at him as much as it did at her, but giving in to it wouldn't help. They had to keep hope alive. Finding a small clearing, they sank down onto a bed of moss, exhaustion finally claiming them. The silence was broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant murmur of a stream. Despite the ever-present danger, a sense of strange peace settled over her. Here, under the watchful gaze of the ancient trees, she felt a sliver of freedom she hadn't known existed. "Do you think we made the right choice?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She turned to him, her gaze meeting his. "We didn't have a choice," she replied honestly. "This is our only chance." He nodded, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "Then let's make it count. Together." They shared the last of their bread, the simple act of breaking it in half a silent promise of shared struggle and unwavering support. As the shadows lengthened, they huddled together for warmth, the forest noises a strange lullaby against the backdrop of their uncertain future. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams of open fields and clear skies, a stark contrast to the life they had left behind. They woke with the sunrise, the forest coming alive with the sounds of a new day. Though unsure of what lay ahead, they were no longer prisoners. They were fugitives, yes, but also pioneers forging their own path towards a life of freedom. This new reality was daunting, but the fear was laced with a sliver of exhilaration. They may not have known where their journey would lead, but they were determined to face it together, one step at a time. The days blurred into one another, a relentless march through the dense wilderness. Their clothes snagged on thorns, their faces scratched by low-hanging branches. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, a constant companion. Yet they pressed on, driven by a burning desire for freedom and the fear of capture snapping at their heels. One evening, they stumbled upon a narrow, meandering stream. Relief washed over them. Water meant survival. He knelt at the bank, cupping his hands to drink. "Wait," she cautioned, stopping him. "We don't know where it leads." He frowned, frustration flickering in his eyes. "We can't afford to be picky. We're dehydrated." She understood his desperation, but caution was paramount. Their survival depended on making the right choices. "Let's follow it upstream for a bit. See where it takes us." They followed the stream cautiously, their senses on high alert. The dense foliage offered both protection and concealment, but also limited their visibility. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent their hearts racing, every unfamiliar sound a potential threat. As dusk settled, they stumbled upon a clearing. A small, ramshackle cabin nestled amongst the trees, smoke curling from its chimney. Relief and apprehension warred within them. Was it a haven or a trap? "We can't stay out here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "But should we trust this?" The question hung heavy in the air. They had encountered no other signs of life in their days of wandering. This isolated cabin could be just what they needed, or it could be a deadly encounter. There might be others, she mused, her voice vaguely audible. People who might help us. He weighed the options, his brow furrowed in thought. "We can't risk being seen approaching." He finally said, "Let's wait until nightfall. If there's no sign of danger, we can approach in the morning." They settled in the thick undergrowth, anxiety gnawing at their insides. Nightfall descended slowly, cloaking the forest in an inky blackness. The only light came from the flickering glow of the cabin window, a beacon in the darkness. As the hours wore on, a rhythmic sound drifted through the trees, the gentle strum of a lute. The soft melody was strangely calming, a flicker of humanity in the wilderness. It wasn't the sound of danger, at least. "Maybe they're not so bad after all," she whispered, a sliver of hope blossoming in her chest. He didn't respond, but a glimmer of agreement flickered in his eyes. Perhaps, just perhaps, this solitary cabin held the promise of a temporary respite, a chance to catch their breath and reassess their next move. With a newfound sense of cautious optimism, they settled in for a restless night, the melody a lullaby against the backdrop of their uncertain future. Dawn crept through the trees, painting the clearing in soft hues of gold and pink. Exhaustion clung to them like a shroud, but a sliver of hope flickered in their hearts. The cabin remained silent, the source of the lute music a mystery. "We should approach carefully," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. She nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger strapped at her thigh. The weapon offered a sliver of comfort, a small reassurance in a world filled with unknowns. Together, they crept towards the cabin, their movements silent and practiced. The closer they got, the clearer the scent of wood smoke became, mingling with a faint aroma of baking bread. Her stomach rumbled, a stark reminder of their empty bellies. Reaching the rickety wooden door, they exchanged a nervous glance. He took a deep breath and knocked, the sound echoing hollowly in the stillness. Silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Just as doubt began to creep in, the door creaked open, revealing a wizened old woman with eyes as sharp as flint. "Can I help you?" she rasped, her voice surprisingly strong for her age. They hesitated, unsure how to proceed. "We were hoping," he began, then faltered. "Lost, are you?" She finished his sentence, a knowing glint in her eyes. That path doesn't see many travelers these days. Relief washed over them, so intense it almost left them breathless. Yes, she stammered, finding her voice. We've been wandering for days. The woman studied them for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Then, a hint of a smile played on her lips. Well, come in then. You look like you could use some rest and a hot meal. Hesitantly, they stepped inside. The cabin was small and cluttered, with a warm fire crackled in the hearth, casting a welcoming glow. The aroma of baking bread filled the air, a tantalizing torture for their empty stomachs. You haven't introduced yourselves, the woman said, her voice gruff, but not unkind. She began, then faltered. Their real names were a dangerous reminder of the life they left behind. The woman chuckled, a dry rasping sound. No need for that here. Call me Ilara, and you too. They exchanged a quick glance. In this isolated haven, perhaps anonymity wasn't necessary. I'm Kai, he said, his voice firm. And I'm Anya, she added, a newfound sense of ease settling in. Ilara gestured towards two rough-hewn chairs by the fire. Sit down, children. Get yourselves warm. That bread will be ready soon. As they settled in, a sense of peace, long forgotten, washed over them. The warmth of the fire seeped into their chilled bones, and the promise of food filled them with a much-needed energy. Here, in this tiny cabin, they had found a sanctuary, a brief respite from the relentless pursuit that hung over their heads. But for how long, they didn't know. As they devoured the warm bread, a silent question lingered in the air. Was Ilara a true ally, or simply another unknown on their perilous journey? Days turned into weeks under Ilara's watchful gaze. The old woman, despite her initial gruffness, proved to be a surprisingly kind host. She fed them well, her simple meals a welcome contrast to their days of foraging for meager scraps. She allowed them to rest, their bodies slowly recovering from the grueling journey. One crisp morning, as they sat by the fire, Ilara broke the comfortable silence. You can't stay here forever, she said, her voice blunt, but not unkind. Kai, who had been lost in thoughts, startled at the sound of her voice. We know, he admitted, a tinge of dejection in his voice. We weren't sure where to go from here. Anya, who had been mending a tear in her worn cloak, looked up. Is there another way out of this forest? She asked, a flicker of hope sparking in her eyes. Ilara studied them for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. There's an old trail, she finally said, her voice low. But it's dangerous. Not many make it through. Kai's jaw clenched. We don't have many choices, do we? Ilara shook her head. The patrols are getting closer. It won't be long before they find you here. A heavy silence descended upon them. The weight of their situation pressed down on them like a physical burden. They had found a temporary haven, a brief respite from the harsh reality of their escape, but their journey was far from over. What makes the trail so dangerous? Anya finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ilara's gaze flickered towards the window as if searching for something in the dense foliage beyond. It runs along the border, she said, her voice low. There are guards. Kai's hand instinctively went to the dagger strapped to his thigh. The thought of facing armed guards sent a jolt of fear through him. But it's the only way out of this forest, Ilara continued, her voice firm. And the only way to a town that might be willing to help you. Anya met Kai's gaze, a silent conversation passing between them. They knew the risks, the near impossible odds of successfully crossing the border. But staying with Ilara wasn't an option. The longer they stayed, the more they endangered her. "We'll take it," Kai said finally, his voice resolute. Elara nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "Then you'd better be prepared to leave tomorrow. I'll show you what you need to know about the trail." The warmth of the fire seemed to dim as the reality of their imminent departure settled in. They had found a haven, a brief flicker of hope in the midst of darkness. But as with all good things, it was fleeting. Tomorrow they would face the unknown again, the border looming large, a symbol of both danger and potential freedom. As they drifted off to sleep that night, the weight of their decision hung heavy in the air, a silent promise to face whatever awaited them beyond the safety of Elara's cabin. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows as Elara led them through the dense undergrowth. The air was crisp, carrying the damp scent of earth and decaying leaves. Each rustle in the bushes sent shivers down Anya's spine. This wasn't just any path. It was a path etched with danger. "Stay low," Elara rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "The trail runs close to the border fence for a while. We need to avoid being spotted." Kai, his face grim, adjusted the backpack slung over his shoulder. It held meager supplies, a few crusts of bread, a canteen of water, and a map Elara had painstakingly drawn the night before. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. They crept along the narrow path, their senses on high alert. The silence was broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the snap of a twig underfoot. Anya felt a constant knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Every rustle of leaves, every fallen log, seemed to take on a menacing form. After what felt like an eternity, they came to a clearing. A towering metal fence stretched before them, its barbed wire glinting coldly in the rising sun. Beyond it, watchtowers loomed ominously on the horizon, figures silhouetted against the sky. Anya's breath hitched in her throat. This was it. The border. The line separating their old life from their uncertain future. "There's a weak spot in the fence a few miles north," Elara explained, pointing towards a distant cluster of trees. "But be careful. The guards patrol frequently." Kai nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "How do we know when it's safe to cross?" Elara pursed her lips. "There's no foolproof way. You'll have to rely on your instincts." A heavy silence descended upon them. The weight of their decision pressed down on them like a physical burden. This was the point of no return. There was no turning back now. "Thank you, Elara," Anya finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Elara placed a weathered hand on Anya's shoulder, her gaze filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Be strong, child. Remember, freedom comes at a price." Kai stepped forward, his voice gruff. "We won't forget your help." Elara nodded curtly, then turned and disappeared back into the dense foliage. They watched her go, a sense of loneliness settling over them. Elara had been a beacon of hope in the midst of their despair, a reminder that kindness could still exist in the world. With a final glance at the imposing border fence, Anya and Kai exchanged a look. They knew the risks, the dangers that lurked on the other side. But they also knew that staying put wasn't an option. Taking a deep breath, Anya squeezed Kai's hand. "Ready?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "As we'll ever be," he replied. Together, they turned towards the north, towards the weak spot in the fence, a silent promise hanging between them. They would face their fears together. They would cross the border or die trying. Their journey for freedom had just begun. Hours crawled by as they inched their way north, the imposing metal fence a constant reminder of the danger that lurked beyond. The dense foliage offered some cover, but also hindered their progress. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent their hearts racing, every snapping twig a potential alarm. Anya felt a growing sense of desperation gnawing at her. The sun, once a beacon of hope, now seemed to mock their slow progress. How much longer could they keep this up? Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and fatigue weighed heavily on their limbs. Suddenly, Kai stopped, his hand raised in a silent signal. Anya froze, her senses on high alert. A faint sound carried through the air, the unmistakable clanging of boots on metal. Guards! They crouched behind a thick cluster of bushes, their breaths catching in their throats. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the low murmur of voices speaking a language harsh and unfamiliar. Anya squeezed Kai's hand, fear sending a cold shiver down her spine. "They're patrolling," he whispered, his voice tense. "We need to find another way around." Anya scanned their surroundings, her gaze finally settling on a fallen log partially obscured by bushes. It wouldn't offer much cover, but it was their only hope. "We can crawl under it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But we need to be quick." They waited until the sound of the patrol faded into the distance before making their move. Kai inched forward first, disappearing under the low-lying log. Anya followed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The space beneath the log was cramped and dusty, filled with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Anya felt a spider brush against her arm, sending a jolt of revulsion through her, but she forced herself to stay still. Every rustle, every sound, seemed amplified in the confined space. An agonizing eternity seemed to pass before the sound of footsteps returned. This time, the clanging was closer, directly above them. Anya held her breath, her body rigid with fear. "Anything here?" A voice rasped, heavy with boredom. "Nope, just some old logs," came a gruff reply. The sound of boots receded again, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. Slowly, Anya and Kai emerged from their cramped refuge, relief washing over them like a tidal wave. "We were lucky," Kai whispered, his voice shaky. Anya nodded, unable to speak. Her throat was dry, her body trembling from the ordeal. But they were alive. They had cheated death for another minute, another hour. They pressed on, their determination renewed. The weak spot in the fence seemed further away than ever, but giving up wasn't an option. With each step they took, a sliver of hope flickered in their hearts. They would cross this border. They would find freedom. As the day wore on, the forest began to thin, giving way to an expanse of rolling hills. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose from the ground, a potential sign of life. But it could also be a patrol outpost. "Let's rest for a bit," Anya suggested, her voice hoarse. They found a small clearing, collapsing beneath the shade of a lone oak tree. Exhaustion claimed them instantly, the tension draining from their bodies in a wave. Despite the precariousness of their situation, sleep, fitful and brief, claimed them. Anya woke with a start, a jolt of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. How long had they slept? "Kai!" she called out, her voice a panicked whisper. A rustle from a nearby bush sent a wave of relief washing over her. Kai emerged, his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes determined. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. They rose, their bodies stiff and protesting. But there was no time to waste. The smoke in the distance beckoned, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. With renewed determination, they set off towards the unknown, the promise of a new life just a breath away.